Hello, and welcome to It Matters How We Treat One Another, the Social Psychology Show. I'm your host, Matthew David Vasco. If you subscribe to the show on YouTube or your favorite podcasting platform, then thank you. This is a new show, and we are grateful for each and every one of our subscribers. If you haven't subscribed yet, then please consider doing so. There's lots more coming up, and you won't want to miss a single episode. This episode, I will be talking to trauma-informed care specialist Liz Arnold about this exciting new way to think about how we relate to one another. Trauma-informed care is going to be especially interesting to you if you're a parent or work with children, or if you have ever experienced trauma in your own life. We open today with our inspiring news segment. If inspiring things are happening in your neck of the woods, then please email me at mdvasco@gmail.com. That's M as in Matthew, D as in David, VASKO @gmail.com, and let me know. This week's inspiring news comes from Good News Network. The headline reads, PE coach pairs unmotivated students to run with shelter dogs. Adoptions soar. I thought this headline was a little humorous because I thought it was going to say that the students learned to love running. But no, they fell in love with the shelter dogs, and who wouldn't? Shelter dogs are wonderful and easy to love. It's a heartwarming story. What made me want to share this story is that it's a program that could be duplicated at many schools, maybe yours, maybe your child's school. See, what happened was cross-country coach Luis Escobar created this program through a partnership with his school's local animal shelter. The dogs needed exercise and the runners needed motivation, so he thought it seemed like a perfect pairing. The surprise came when the students fell in love with the dogs. So feel free to start up a program like this at your school or in your community, having kids run with shelter dogs. It sounds like a great idea, a perfect pairing, but be aware that the kids might just fall in love with the dogs and want to take them home. Again, if you know of inspiring news happening in your area, please email me at mdvasco@gmail.com. Thanks. And now our interview. My guest today is Liz Arnold. Since July of 2013, Liz Arnold has been with Young and Healthy, a nationally recognized program in Pasadena, California. As program director, Liz has been instrumental in leading Young and Healthy to develop a program bringing the most current research and best practices around the concept of trauma-informed care. Liz co-authored a research-based trauma-informed care manual for use in early childhood settings. She holds a BS in child development and an MS in psychology with emphasis on child and adolescent development. Welcome, Liz.
Thanks, Matt. Nice to be here with you.
Thanks for being here. Yes,
Yeah.
it's such a pleasure to get to talk to you. I'm so familiar with your work and was really a big fan of the work that Young and Healthy did with Willard Elementary School in Pasadena. That's
Mhm.
where my kids went, and they had a wonderful experience there. And I really saw trauma-informed care at work in that school with the teachers and the administrators. And so it made me want to bring you on the show and talk to you about this topic.
Oh, well,
So,
thanks.
so before we started, you were saying that there's sort of a disclaimer that you give at all of your presentations. Could you maybe give that disclaimer for us?
Yeah, absolutely. When we talk about trauma, it can sometimes be triggering, right? We're going to mention and talk about some things that perhaps some of the audience has experienced. And so I just like to make sure that we acknowledge that some of the information we're about to share might be kind of difficult for some of us to hear. And so please, maybe if you are feeling a little bit uncomfortable or you're a little bit nervous about what we're about to the experience we're about to have together, maybe take a deep breath, do what you need to do to kind of center, calm yourself. And then if ever during this conversation things get a little bit overwhelming, it's okay to take a pause. It's okay to hit pause and come back after a few minutes when you've had a chance to kind of get back and calm yourself a little bit, kind of recenter, kind of self-regulate. Because sometimes these things can be hard to hear. I know when I first heard this, it was a little bit triggering for me. The good news is it's also it can really help you to understand a lot of things about yourself, about things that go on around you, about people in your life. And so it can be very rewarding and actually very comforting to have this information. So there's both sides of it, but I always like to start with that acknowledgement.
Thank you. So let's start right from the beginning, and for the sake of trauma-informed care, maybe you could define for us, what do you mean when you say trauma?
Yeah, trauma. What is trauma? We hear it often, don't we? We hear that word often, I think more often than we maybe have in the past. So the basic definition of trauma is a threat that we are not prepared to handle, or something that undermines our sense of safety. Right? So that sense that we feel like we know where we belong, who we are, what's going on around us, that we can relax and be in that safe place. We all experience stress, right? There's three different kinds of stress that we can talk about. One is positive stress. And I'm going to say that, positive stress is that kind of stress that motivates you to do better. The kind of stress that's just enough, perhaps like today. With my experience being on as a guest on your show, positive stress, right? It's a motivator in a way. Motivates me to prepare, to be ready, right? And that's positive. The second kind of stress we can talk about is tolerable stress. So maybe you were rear-ended, had a minor fender bender, right? And so you have to handle all of that where no one was injured. You have to handle all of that and navigate that stress. We call that tolerable stress, the kind of stress that happens. It's a little bit more than that positive stress, but still manageable, right? Okay. And then when we talk about trauma, what we really mean is the kind of feeling that you get from toxic stress. And what toxic stress is, like, as I already said, that kind of stress that we connect with trauma. It's prolonged activation of your stress response system. So when you feel that stress, right, we have that feeling of maybe our breathing gets faster, or our heart rate gets higher. We might perspire a little bit when we're feeling that. When we stay in that stress response, in the absence of relief or protective relationships, and I want us all to remember that, protective relationships, that's when it becomes toxic stress. And what's fascinating to me, especially about toxic stress, is that our brain can't distinguish one type of toxic stress, whether that be childhood stress or something that happened as an adult, or one-time kind of stress, or prolonged stress that we might associate with burnout. Our brain does not distinguish one from another. It's all stress, and our bodies have the same response, so it has the same effect on us. And what's important to know about that when it comes to the conversation we're having today about trauma and how it affects children is that when the adversity that a child experiences or that we experience as children can affect how our stress response functions long term. So it actually changes when we're in that prolonged state of stress, most especially during the most key developmental years. It causes long-term changes in our brains and bodies that lead to long-term health effects as an adult. Okay. Because it literally changes the structure of your brain.
And then what do we mean when we say trauma-informed care?
So trauma-informed care recognizes and acknowledges that role that trauma can play in an individual's life. And it also recognizes and acknowledges the presence of what we call trauma symptoms. It's not a program. Trauma-informed care is not a program. It's a shift in our focus, or as I like to say, it's a flip of the script, right? We're going to change things up from when we see certain kinds of behavior or when we know someone's having a difficult time. We switch it up from, hey, what's wrong with you? And instead we ask the question, what's happened to you? What have your experiences been that have led you to have maybe a lower threshold to tolerate stress, or maybe a quicker reaction time to go into your stress response because your brain has been kind of rewired to go to that stress response more quickly.
I see.
There's some control. Then we can talk about the components of a trauma-informed approach. What does that look like, right? What does it look like to understand and recognize it? Well, to learn about, right, we're doing it right now, the first component, which is to learn about the prevalence and the impact of trauma. And we can talk about some of the study. We're going to talk about the ACEs study. Next thing is recognizing the signs of toxic stress in yourself, which is probably the harder part, right? And in others. Like, what does that look like? And then we can use some of the evidence-based practices that we know have been the research has shown us, as well as doing our best to resist re-traumatization. So what part our brain does when we become accustomed, or when we spend a lot of time in our stress response, is it heightens our stress response and makes it, for lack of another way to say it right now, more sensitive. So we can be re-traumatized. Something can remind us of a trauma, and we can go back there and be in that same place. Our brain takes us back there very quickly. Our brain is a prediction machine. We learn how to interact with our environment based on our past experiences. So if we recognize that something reminds us of a negative experience or a past trauma, our brain says, same thing's going to happen. Get ready. Here we go. And so that stress response comes on fast and strong, so that so our brain is protecting us from the effects of that potential re-traumatization.
I see. So you mentioned ACEs, and I understand that is adverse childhood experiences.
Yes, adverse childhood experiences. That term comes from a study that was done in 1998 in partnership between Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control. Two doctors, Doctors Onda and Folletti, looked at 10 different conditions or 10 different experiences that a child between 0 and 18 years of age could live in or experience, and the long-term effects that had and the commonality that we saw. They actually had a clinic, and they were helping, it was a weight loss clinic, and they were helping patients to navigate and create healthier habits. And what they found was they did really great when they were in the facility, or when they were in the program. But long-term, they were having a hard time seeing those long-term positive effects. And so they said, okay, as we're talking to these patients, we're recognizing a lot of them are sharing some similar experiences with us. So I wonder what's the common theme here? And so they looked at 10 different things in the original study. And the 10 things centered around abuse, which included physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. They looked at neglect, both physical and emotional neglect. And they looked at household dysfunction. What do we mean by household dysfunction? Living with an adult who has a mental illness. Having one of their relatives, their close relatives, a parent or another close relative, incarcerated. Seeing their mother being treated violently. Having someone in the family who has a substance abuse issue. And something as common as divorce in a family. And what they found was that about 64% of the people in that study, and this study was done in an upper middle class college educated county in San Diego. And what they found was 64% of those adults reported that they had experienced at least one of those ACEs before the age of 18. Nearly 1 in 6 of those adults reported that they had experienced 4 or more of those ACEs. And what we know now to be true is that ACEs don't occur alone. It's very common that if you have one, there's an 87% chance that you have 2 or more. So they very infrequently occurred on their own, right? And you can understand how that can happen in a family dynamic, especially if you have, for example, someone who is mentally ill, who has a mental illness. Very frequently, we see people with mental illness will self-medicate, right? So now you've got 2 ACEs right there, right? We have a substance abuse issue. That can often lead to poor parenting decisions, right? So now you can add maybe abuse or neglect to that, and the breakup of the family, right? The separation of the adults in the family. So very, I hate to say easily, right? You've got those 4 ACEs for a child that has experienced 4 ACEs.
Who are some people in a community who might want to consider getting training in trauma-informed care?
I feel like we should all be trained in trauma-informed care. We should all be at least aware of ACEs and how trauma can affect a developing brain and how trauma can affect us as adults. Since the original study, there's been a lot more research about what is traumatizing, right? What trauma is. And I want to just make sure that I, at this point, mention that it's really, trauma is defined by the person who experienced it, not by anyone outside of that person's experience, determining whether or not that was traumatic or not. Because trauma is really determined by the way I experienced it. So sometimes you have 2 people who experience maybe the exact same event, and it affects them differently. And there's a lot of factors that play into that. But it's really about how I interpreted what happened to me, how I experienced what happened to me, so that I can decide whether or not it was a trauma, right? And so being aware of that is even very important. But there's all kinds of different traumas now that we recognize outside of those household experiences or household ACEs. We now know that there are realms of ACEs. And so there's environmental ACEs, right? Some of the things that we might experience as a force of nature, a hurricane, a tornado, the strong windstorms that we had very recently just here in Pasadena, right? Drove by a house just yesterday, huge tree uprooted in the front yard. It's an environmental ACE, the potential environmental ACE. And then we have our community ACEs, which could be violence and poverty. When we think about an ACE that we all have in common, or I shouldn't say an ACE, a trauma that we all have in common, or a community experience, I think about our pandemic that we just all, we still are navigating, right? It's the greatest common denominator that we all have as far as the way we experience that and a trauma, a potential trauma for all of us. So being able to identify that for everyone to be able to be understanding of how that may or might have affected someone, it is valuable to us as a community and building a culture of being trauma-informed care, or being trauma-informed, excuse me.
So who are some of those people? I mean, you said everyone, but let's try to think along the lines of like adults who work with kids and things like that. Like, of course, maybe the answer I'm digging for is for you to say teachers.
Yes, teachers, for sure. That would be my first. And the good news is that would have been my first answer, right? So definitely teachers should be aware of the ACEs study and what trauma-informed care is. Anyone who works with children, most especially, I think it's really important to understand and be able to filter behavior in a different way, or what we're observing as far as behavior. But also anybody who works with people. I think anyone who manages a team should be aware of trauma-informed care and how the way that we behave and the things that we do, and having a trauma-informed culture can really affect someone. For example, one of the important characteristics of a trauma-informed approach is trustworthiness and transparency. So what that means is being really consistent, right? And if I do what I say I'm going to do, But also, I think transparency is so important. For someone who's experienced a lot of trauma, not knowing what's going to happen is very, it can be triggering or at least unsettling, right? It can cause that stress response. So not knowing what's going to appear on an agenda at a meeting, or when someone says, hey, can we meet? Without letting you know, hey,
Right.
can we meet?
I think everyone who's ever been in a job before understands the stress of, of can we
Exactly.
meet?
Can we meet? Right? What does that mean? Right?
Right.
Of course we can. Right. So that kind of transparency, letting people know what to expect and what they can prepare for, really is part of a trauma-informed culture, right? And then having collaboration and mutuality, being open and saying, let's work on this together, rather than that top-down philosophy, right? That more of that partnership in a trauma-informed culture is going to be less triggering and a little bit more stress, or a little bit more security, provide a little bit more of that sense of security for anyone that we're working with. So doctors, for certain, we know that doctors should, having that information and understanding for physicians will help them to direct the care that they give to their patients, and understand what the risks, what the potential health risks are. I mean, the potential health risks are actually pretty incredible when you think about that. 7 out of the 10 leading causes of death, including heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, are all increased when a person has experienced childhood ACEs. We know that there's increased incidence of even things like broken bones, depression, autoimmune diseases, and having 6 or more ACEs can actually shorten your life by 20 years.
Oh my
So,
goodness.
yeah. So having our doctors be informed about trauma and the effects of trauma is very important to our community. So understanding, and you mentioned teachers. What are the kind of things that teachers can be aware of? First of all, that kids with students with a score of 3 are 3 times more likely to experience academic failure. Their brains are not available for learning when they get to school. Their brains are still caught up in that stress response, especially, I once was working with a lovely group of kindergarten teachers, and one teacher said, I don't get it. I offer them this calming corner, and many of my students come to school saying, can I go sit in the can I have a few moments in the calming corner? And she said, they just got here. What could they need to sit in the calming corner about? Right. But we don't know what that child has experienced before they even left their front door. Right. They come to school. So some of these students come to school not ready, not able, not available for real engagement, for real learning. A lot of them have, they're 5 times more likely to have attendance issues, right? Harder for them to get to school. And they're 6 times more likely to exhibit school, problem behaviors, what we term problem behaviors, right? They have holes in their learning that differ from having learning disabilities, and they have a lack of self-trust in their own abilities, and that causes them to have generally low self-esteem. So it's harder for them to engage. So when teachers are trauma-informed, when teachers learn about the effects of trauma, they can be more responsive to those children in that way.
I think that leads me really well to my next question, which is, what sorts of changes might someone expect to find in an elementary school, for example, when teachers, staff, and administrators put trauma-informed care to use?
First thing that we'll see is that they look beyond the behavior. They recognize that behavior is communication. And instead of reacting to the behavior, they respond to the student. So they might do things like ask more questions and to get a little bit more information out of the child before, right? They filter it through these 3 questions. Is this developmentally appropriate, right? Is the behavior I'm seeing what we would expect for a 9-year-old, right? Is that just being 9? So, and if that's so, then that means that child has a skill that they need to learn, right? if it's, maybe it's discipline. And when I say discipline, I don't mean that they need discipline in that old fashioned way, but I mean, when we talk about discipline, we're talking about boundaries. We're talking about clear guidelines and expectations that are attainable for the development, the developmental appropriateness for that child. Okay. But then the last filter that we can use is this child in distress? Is something really bothering this child? Is something else behind this behavior? I have an example of a student who had a football in their backpack. And the rule was that the backpacks had to be left at the back of the classroom. And the child would not put the backpack at the back of the classroom. Nope, the backpack's got to stay with me. So every day, this child was being given a consequence for not following directions. And they were sent to the principal's office. And it was different in the principal's office for one reason. The principal asked the child a very, very simple question. Why? Why won't you put your backpack at the back of the room?
Right.
And the child responded that because the last time I did that, something that was really important to me was stolen out of my backpack. So now I don't trust that I can leave it, unattended. And so was that child being defiant, or was that child, engaging in an adaptive behavior to protect themselves? Right. And when so a trauma-informed environment, we ask more questions. We look beyond the behavior. We recognize that behavior is communication, and it's telling us one of two things. Either there's a skill that has not yet been learned, or there's a need that is not being met. And when we can look at that and recognize that maybe what the need is a little bit is connection. They don't feel like they belong, or they're struggling with something and they don't have the words to communicate. And so that's what you're going to see. I think those are the biggest differences you're going to see in a trauma-informed environment in a school.
What sorts of skills are involved in doing trauma-informed work that teacher might then possess? Do you know what I'm saying? Like now the teacher's taking trauma-informed care training. They're going back to their classroom. What are they now equipped with?
Well, we call them universal precautions, right? We're all very familiar with universal precautions in a whole different way now. But yeah, they're equipped with understanding that what children need first and foremost, and they lead with what we need to lead with as the adults in their lives, is the relationship and connection. When we can establish relationship and we can make sure the child has a sense of belonging and connection to their teacher, to their classroom, to their community, it relaxes their brain in a way that allows for them to be open and free to learn. They're able to learn. And so being able to understand, I think that first thing is to understand that the importance of relationship and connection. Relationship and connection is the great mitigator and preventer of trauma. And so trauma-informed teachers, a trauma-informed environment understands that it's not about consequences and discipline, that if we lead with relationship and connection, it's going to take us a lot farther. That child's going to be more successful in the classroom. And when we engage in empathetic listening and asking those questions like why, it's really powerful to make that connection. Like when somebody says to you, like, I get it. I understand why you might feel that way, or I understand why you do feel that way. Right? It's disarming, and it opens us up for connection with another person. It makes us feel safer. And kids need to be able to feel safe in order to learn.
I'm listening to some of these things you're describing, and it reminds me of for something we talk about in the business world, or the world of adults working with adults, where we call it emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
Is there a correlation between trauma-informed care and emotional intelligence?
Yes. I think wow, that's a really good question. When we see growth in emotional intelligence is when we really have that ability to learn, right? And to make those connections. because that comes from that emotional intelligence is really a function of our prefrontal cortex, the most sophisticated part of our brain. So the connection is that when we have an emotionally intelligent adult who's engaging with a child, they're going to be able to get past their own traumas and get past their own triggers and truly engage right outside of their own. They've done that. The other thing is that we can't really help a child achieve emotional intelligence unless they have that ability to access the front part of their brain through that ability to be relaxed, to be not worried about what else is going on around them, not in their trauma state, right? So they're able to be there. They're fully present.
I saw a teacher at Willard Elementary, a kindergarten teacher who had been through trauma-informed care training, working with a child who I knew was going through a lot outside of school. And her patience with this child was impressive, I think, to say the least.
Yeah.
I mean, would you say patience is wrapped up in it, or is that sort of the result of some of these other skills that people learn?
I think it's wrapped up in it and it's a result. I think both is true. I would say one of the things that we talk about when we talk about one of the strategies that you can employ to be more trauma informed, like when I think about things that I need to do, one of the terms we use is drop the mirror, right? And it kind of plays into the emotional intelligence. Drop the mirror means when we cannot see ourselves reflected in that behavior, right? It's not about that child is mad at me, or it's not about that child is attacking me, right? Hey, what did I do? I didn't do anything. Why are you getting all mad at me? Because it's not really about me. There's something else going on for that child, or for that adult for that matter, right? And so being able to say, it's not about me, there's something else going on here. And that's what I mean by, kind of get past our own triggers, dropping that mirror, not letting it be about me. I don't see myself as it's not about something I did. It's about what they've experienced, right? Not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you.
What happened to you?
What have you been through? Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. I think there's a shift that can happen in all of us when we change our mind frame that way, right? Away from defensiveness, one might call it defensiveness,
Exactly.
right? What did I do?
What did I do? Yeah.
Right. To what you just said, which is what happened to you.
What are you going through right now?
Yeah.
That is causing this reaction. That doesn't make sense to me. I don't get it. But, and I might think and we get to, I think defensiveness is a great word, right? I get defensive because, hey, I didn't do anything to cause this. But it's nothing to do with me. Another example I can use of a trigger is if you step off the curb crossing the street, right? And you go to step off the curb and you almost get hit by a car. So you jump back, right? And you're having your stress response, your heart's beating, you're sweating, right? Wow, that was really traumatic, right? That was a big moment. Okay. If by some chance on that same corner, on the house right next to you, somebody's cutting their lawn and you're smelling fresh cut grass, the possibility exists that you will smell fresh cut grass and associate it with that trauma of almost getting hit by a car.
Wow.
So I wouldn't know that that's your trigger, right? I'd have no idea. It makes no sense, right? To me, honestly, it makes no sense that fresh cut grass makes you think of almost getting hit by a car. But that's how our brain works. We take in everything that's going on around us when we experience something that's traumatic, and then we relate it to that event.
And I imagine in a case like that, the person who's experiencing the trigger might not even themselves know that this is a trigger for me, fresh cut grass, right?
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. Yeah. Yeah. And, another example that I use often is kind of a silly one is fried chicken. So our neighborhood supermarket cooking fried chicken in there all the time. Fried chicken was what my husband ate at family dinners when he was a child. So when he walks into that supermarket, he gets a smile on his face from ear to ear, because those were really happy memories for him, right?
Oh.
So the smell of the fried chicken brings back those happy memories and makes him feel happy. And if those had been unhappy memories for him, the smell of that fried chicken might make him feel like, I'm never going back to that store again.
Right. Or he's grumpy every time you go
Or
grocery
he's
shopping. You
grumpy
have
every
no
time he
idea
goes grocery.
why, right?
Yeah,
What
right.
is
And it's
with
not about the
you?
prices. It's not about the prices. But yeah, exactly. Exactly. The way our brain works, especially when we're experiencing the trauma, all of our senses are heightened. So we take in all of this extra information, so that we can, because what we're trying to do is protecting ourselves, right? It's our fight or flight
Right.
response. And it's old as humankind. And it worked really well for us and still works really well for us at times. But it worked really well for us when we were trying to protect ourselves from a bear chasing us in the woods, or a lion attacking us, in the jungle, when we were foraging for food. You needed to have that stress response, which is that your brain shuts down and we get just ready to run, or we get ready to fight, right? Because we don't need to think about all that other stuff. We only need to think about, how do I protect myself in this moment? And like I said earlier, our brain doesn't distinguish between physical danger and emotional danger. It doesn't distinguish between what's causing the toxic stress. Our body just does the exact same thing, regardless of what the stressor is.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, I have just one more question to kind of give people some takeaways from this interview that they might be able to put right to use in their lives, which is, what are maybe 3 simple things a person can do to put trauma-informed care to work without a lot of training?
Without a lot of training. The first thing we already talked about, I think the number one thing is work on flipping that script, right? Think about people instead of in that, what's wrong with you? What did I do? Why are you reacting that way to me? To, what is this person experience that's making them feel this way, or making them react this way, right? Instead of what's wrong with you, what happened to you? So we already talked about that. Again, the other thing we talked about that goes along with dropping the mirror. The next thing is practicing our own self-regulation. So recognizing our own triggers, knowing what are those things, or what are those feelings that I get that let me know that stress response is rising in me. I'm going up the arc, right? And I'm getting to the top of that arc. What are those things that happen? We talk about maybe getting a flushed or a hot feeling, or maybe your stomach starts to feel uncomfortable, or you start to perspire, your heart rate goes up. What are those things that you can say, okay, I'm starting to feel these feelings come on, and before they become out of control, beyond my control, what are some of those things I can do to slow things down? Maybe I need to take a walk. Maybe I need to take a few deep breaths or walk away, which goes along with the next thing, which is de-escalate before we discuss, right? If we know that someone else is triggered, or we're feeling triggered or escalated, it's okay to say, I need a few minutes. Let me come back to this. Or say, Jim Sporleader, who was one of the leaders in trauma-informed education, when he talks about the way he engages with students. And what he says is, when a student is escalated, or when he is escalated, he will say to the student, if they're escalated, I respect you too much to have this conversation while you're feeling this way. Let's wait until things are a little calmer, and then we'll talk about it. And he says vice versa. He'll say to that student, I respect you too much to talk to you while I'm feeling this way. I won't be using the part of my brain I need to be using to make this a meaningful conversation. So we're going to wait a few minutes. So it's okay to wait. We don't have to have those conversations quick. We can say, let's have a minute. Let's take a minute here. And then, of course, practicing compassion and forgiveness for each other. Right? We don't know what someone else has experienced. We don't know where they're coming from. And so understanding that we all are walking around with a backpack, right? And I like to think about it like an invisible backpack. And our traumas, especially our childhood traumas, are getting packed in there. And when we're children, we're not packing our own backpack, being packed for us. And when we get to be, we often think, oh, well, you're an adult now, you should be able to handle yourself differently. Yes. And we also don't get to drop that backpack,
Mm.
right? It stays with us. And so those things influence who we are, how we view the world, how we filter information that's coming at us. So yeah, those are some things we can do.
And I suppose that as adults, if we experienced trauma as a child, we might be able to maybe shift the load in our backpack
Absolutely.
or unpack things a little through therapy and working on our own emotional well-being. I would think, right?
Most definitely. That's the best news. The best news is that our brains, we have what's called neuroplasticity. And so we are always able to relearn or
Mm.
unlearn or change the way we think about things with intention and purpose. We can change the way we think about things. And it used to be, and I tell on myself all the time, when I was an undergrad, they actually taught us that once you were 18, that was it. That was the most potential you were probably going to have, right? So don't even try it. Not even, that's who you are. And now we know that that's not even close to being accurate, right? We can learn and change the way we think about things, whether it be behaviors or attitudes or thoughts that we have. We can change that. We can flip our own script, right?
There we go.
And like you said, change. Maybe we can't get rid of everything in the backpack, but we can certainly change the weight of how much each thing in our backpack carries for us.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful message that we can change, we can work on ourselves, and our minds are elastic. We can adapt and grow and shift the load. And that sounds like a wonderful, positive note to end on.
Yep. Throughout the lifespan, throughout your lifespan.
Thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much.
Special thanks to our guest, Liz Arnold of Young and Healthy. Young and Healthy's mission is to protect and improve the physical and mental health of uninsured and underserved children and their families in the greater Pasadena area through prevention, education, family support, access to healthcare services, health insurance enrollment, and tax preparation assistance. Visit yapasadena.org for more information. And now for the takeaway. Here are your takeaways from this episode. There are several. Trauma is toxic stress. Protective relationships can help reduce or relieve toxic stress. Prolonged exposure to toxic stress can change the structure of our brains, especially during our formative years. Trauma-informed care flips the script from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. Our brains are prediction machines. We learn how to interact with our environment based on our past experiences. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are more common than seasonal allergies. The majority of us adults probably experienced some kind of trauma during our formative years. And if you work with children, then the majority of those children probably have experienced some type of trauma. So it's worth understanding trauma-informed care. Trauma is defined by the person who has experienced it. The same experience can affect two people differently. An experience that was a potential trauma for all of us is the COVID pandemic. It can be valuable for all of us to view people's experiences with the pandemic through the lens of trauma-informed care. Children and youth with 3 or more ACEs are 3 times more prone to academic failure. So let's care for them. What children need first and foremost is relationship and connection. Relationship and connection is the great mitigator and preventer of trauma. Drop the mirror. Remind yourself that a person's reaction to something you say may not have anything to do with what you actually said. But so don't take it personally. Change your mind frame to what happened to you or what are you going through. People might not even realize their own triggers. Our brains don't distinguish between physical danger and emotional danger. Our flight, fight, freeze, or fawn response could be the same for either. Here are 4 simple things you can do to put trauma-informed care to work in your life right now. 1. Drop the mirror and ask yourself, what happened to you, the other person? 2. Practice your own self-regulation. Learn to recognize your own triggers and learn what you can do to slow things down. 3. De-escalate before you discuss. Wait until things are calmer. And 4. Practice compassion and forgiveness with one another. And finally, your last takeaway from this episode, our brains are elastic. Good news. We have neuroplasticity. We can learn and change the way we think about things and react to things throughout our entire lives. Please subscribe to keep up with all of our episodes, and you can support the show by shopping our Etsy store at etsy.com/shop/It Matters Merch. That's It Matters Merch. There's a link in our description. Your quote for this week is, quote, "People start to heal the moment they feel heard." That is from author Cheryl Richardson. And remember, treat everyone with kindness, respect, empathy, and compassion, and try for acceptance and love whenever possible. Be well, and much love to you all.